Well, and quick, I'm not sure if there's going to be a central thesis to my feelings on this movie because the movie itself is kind of missing a central thesis of sorts. But hey, folks, it's your old pal King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Scardy Skills. Hit like and subscribe. So I saw La Matrice Resurrection yesterday in theaters instead of on HBO Max. I am probably going to watch it again on HBO Max so I can have subtitles on because there were a few moments where the dialogue was so thick that I like definitely feel like I need to actually go back and be able to read what they're saying. Since getting back last night, I've been, watching several YouTube reviews, from your classic selection of, YouTube reviewers. The comparisons to The Last Jedi thing. I don't think it's actually as divisive as The Last Jedi because the general trend, it seems to be everyone's annoyed with this movie. Channels from both sides of the entertainment divide both seem to be nitpicking it pretty badly. I'm not going to say it's a great movie. I'm not really sure how I think about it yet. It's part of why I want to watch it again. I don't dislike it. The worst thing in it is at the very end when it cuts to the credits and you get a Rage Against the Machine song that's been covered by some young girl, which sounds horrible. And like, I was hardly the only dude in that audience that was like, nope, getting out of here. Don't care about whatever end credit scene that they have enough to bother sitting through that torture. The rest of the movie was okay. I feel, part of what my curiosity about it was I thought it would be interesting to see what would happen if we pull the Wachowski siblings apart and just get a movie from one of them. I feel like this, by having done this, we now know which of the Wachowskis was responsible for all the wonky dialogue in the earlier Matrix movies and possibly the headier ideas in the earlier Matrix movies. Because this movie's definitely full of ideas and full of thick psychobabble and technobabble dialogue. And obviously, apparently, it was the other Wachowski, Lily, who was the one who was, bringing the martial arts style and some of the aesthetic qualities. This movie's way less green, for one thing, which in some ways I don't think is a negative. I liked the first plot arc of it, the first third of the movie, probably the most, when you're confused as to what exactly you're watching and what's going on. I found that the most compelling stuff. The further it got into just being yet another standard Matrix movie, the kind of more I kind of got bored with it and was just kind of like, okay, let's hurry this up. There's distinctly a point where I started asking myself, like, what on earth is the third arc of this movie going to be? It dragged here and there, but for the most part, like, the pacing, stayed fine. And in fact, I'd say overall it was better paced than either Matrix Revolutions or Matrix Reloaded. I am not in the camp of people who dislikes those movies. I don't rewatch them very often, if ever. I mean, it's probably been at least half a decade since I've bothered to try to sit through either of them. But it's not because they're bad. They're just bloated and they need a couple of B plots pulled out of those movies to condense them down to something tighter. But they're chock full of great stuff, in spite of that. So I don't think it's right to just discount those twos. No Matrix sequel of any type is ever going to recapture the magic of the first one because the element of surprise and revelation is never going to be there again. So you're kind of stuck with that. Some of the stuff I hear people complaining about is like The Last Jedi in that it's like, wow, guys, this is kind of flying over your head because the things you're complaining about, those weren't accidents. They're features, not bugs of this movie. This movie is a very cynical and bitter undertone statement on reboot culture, I guess you could call it, in Hollywood. It very clearly telegraphs why it's being made. Because if they don't make it, the studio is just going to have someone else make it, and that's entirely out of your control then. So if you still want your baby to even somewhat resemble what you wanted it to be, you might as well go ahead and be the one to make the movie. But there is, like throughout the whole thing, I'm like, so what exactly is the story here? I do think you can fairly say that this movie doesn't really have like a clear-cut plot and goal line for it that's telegraphed throughout the whole thing. So it feels like when you get to the end, you're like, oh, okay, like This is what it was supposed to be building to. It almost kind of like jumps into like a different scenario almost after they get Neo out of the Matrix again. I remember part of the problem with talking about this movie is that like a lot of the early reports and rumors about it were from years ago now, because this is one of the movies that caught up in the whole big great delaying cycle of all the studios putting holds on when they were going to release their various movies that they had. So I kind of vaguely remember hearing something like someone had said something about this movie was going to like reclaim the red pill meme from the right wing. It doesn't. In fact, in some ways, I kind of feel like it reinforces and goes along with the exact same reasoning of why people like using the red pill, blue pill metaphor about life. In terms of whether or not it's got like trans messaging, if it does, it's subtle. I mean, there's a few things like here and there about, like that's definitely like a nod towards body dysphoria kind of stuff. I was thinking it was going to be bolder in many ways than what it was. If in terms of things that disappoint me is that it was a little paint by numbers, but because of the framing at the beginning of the movie about why the cynical reasons why this movie's being made, the fact that it's repackaging so many classic sequences from the original movies isn't laziness. It's more of like an intentional statement on how all these movies unfold now. But like my point of view is weird. When The Last Jedi came out, I went to go see it in theaters opening weekend, and I'm like, wow, that was interesting. It like did so many things backwards of your normal Star Wars movie. I found that interesting because I guess maybe in the Rich Evans camp at the time of just like, Star Wars is actually more played out than people realize. If they're not willing to just completely, pull the brakes off of all the creative artists that they bring in and just allow people to just make whatever they want set in a Star Wars universe, because the studio wanted to just like stick to this narrow, defined set of beats that they think Star Wars should be. It was always just going to be kind of boring. I didn't buy into The Force Awakens when it came out, and everyone was all like, "Oh, this is it's so wonderful of them to give us a movie that was exactly the same as the old movie." And I feel in some ways that like Force Awakens comparisons to Matrix Resurrections is probably maybe a little bit more accurate. But like I say though, like The Last Jedi, I'm just finding a good chunk of the complaints that YouTube reviewers are having. It's like, yeah, I kind of feel like you're kind of missing the point. You're not realizing that that's intentional. Ryan Johnson, I've long kind of maintained, I think was actually really trolling Disney and not the audience. But we live in a world where Fast and the Furious movies are popular. So like, it's really a surprise that any of this kind of stuff tends to flip over people's heads. Like the most common refrain I'm hearing from various YouTubers on both sides is, "There's not enough kung fu in this movie. Oh my God!" Like, was that really what you were getting out of the Matrix movies? Was that they were kung fu movies? That was an aspect of them, but I would hardly say that was the dominant thing. Like I said, like since this movie doesn't have Lily Wachowski behind the camera, that's probably a chunk of why the kung fu doesn't feel the same. Is not shot as well. The action sequence period are probably some of the low lights of the movie. They feel obligatory. There's a little bit too much action. It's hard at times to like clearly like what's going on, who's where. The spacing. You're supposed to be really aware of the space the characters are in and who's where, so that the fight all makes sense. Depending on how you edit it and cut it. And there's times where I just kind of like blurred out for moments, or not even knowing why they just barely get into the Matrix, and already they're immediately in a fight with the Merovingian and his henchmen and that kind of stuff. But if you were to like lay down just like a generic list of elements of what makes a good Matrix movie, it's hard to say that this doesn't fulfill most of them. Like if you were to, when we got back, some of my wife's friends had come over and we were talking about it, and one of them asked me like, on a scale of 5, where would I rate this movie? And as I was feeling last night around 10 p.m., I rated it at a 4 out of 5. I personally would rather use a 10 scale because I would give it like an 8.25 out of 10 as opposed to like a 4 out of 5. If you were using like a school gradient, it's somewhere between B plus and A minus. Like there are things about it that are imperfect, but like the bar had already been like lowered by the last two Matrix movies, and just in terms of overall presentation. It wasn't until afterwards, though, I kind of start to piece together like what the story of this movie was, and if you can call it that. Really, what this movie was doing was just resetting the status quo. By the end of the movie, the status quo is effectively where the status quo was at the end of the first Matrix movie, setting up the potential to have sequels that are more of along the lines of the just random rising action adventures that, like, some of us probably subconsciously missed from the original Matrix trilogy. The original Matrix trilogy starts off, classic hero's journey, call to adventure kind of shit. And then instead of having some middle chapter adventures where we just get some fun stuff going on with the Nebuchadnezzar and its crew as Neo gets more familiar with his powers, and we find out what like the next level Matrix threat's going to be, and they solve some mysteries and all that kind of stuff. We didn't get those. Instead, we went from the opening of a hero's journey and then leapt immediately into Dune Messiah with like blind prophets and all that kind of stuff. There was never a middle transition, and between the way their story was put together and just also that clean cut break in between the two of them, like Revolutions and Reloaded are really just one movie. So we've never actually had a Matrix trilogy unless you put the Animatrix in there. Like I haven't heard too much about it, but there's been some like buzzing about the fact that this movie's dependent on plot points that come out of video games. Which, I never played The Matrix Online, so, not knowing exactly what the hell they're talking about Morpheus having died, and now Morpheus in this movie is like a program that's based on Morpheus, but on a Agent Smith template is kind of how I was reading what they were saying. So you can get a hybrid of like, Agent Smith's tenacity and skill, but with Morpheus's like divine ability to be able to track down and find Neo. Like, it's weird if you're coming into that without having done that, but it's also kind of works as a critique of like a lot of the stuff that fans have been saying about the Star Wars movies, of like how come all these things from like the old expanded universe novels or Knights of the Old Republic or these other like side properties, how come none of that's ever addressed in any of the new Star Wars movies? Well, this movie kind of is giving you an example of maybe why you don't want that. Like, the movie audience is the movie audience. The video game audience is a subset of that movie audience. And so, forcing your audience to have to be filtered through a video game to understand the plot points in the next movie, is kind of a dick move, and most people aren't going to do it. You'd have to design video games that are incredibly easy so that your average moviegoer could even have a chance of getting to the end of it. That game they had, I want to say it was Enter the Matrix, the one that was actually set in between, Revolutions and Reloaded. I remember trying to play it, and it was too hard. Like, it just, for whatever reason, I wasn't getting far enough into it. And so, like, even playing the game, I was never able to unlock all these plot points about Niobe and stuff that you're supposed to know so you're more familiar with her character in the next movie. I eventually just got frustrated and went back to playing a game I liked playing. And so that's what I mean. Like, if you want to have plot points in your films that are dependent upon stuff that happened in video games, then those video games need to be accessible to, like, everyone. They can't be too difficult. It can't be some like hardcore first person shooter where you got to solve a bunch of techno puzzles and shit. Like, what else? You covered that. Yeah, basically it's just resetting the timeline. In our day and age, considering how Hollywood wants to make a big show of inclusivity, you would think if there was going to be any like big blockbuster movie that would get people in seats, that would feature a prominent trans character in the main cast, you would think Lana Wachowski would be the one to make that movie, and it wasn't. Instead, basically, is just, the heroes of the piece is an older, aging Gen X couple, and the movie, whatever story, semblance of a story it has, is really just, an old Gen X couple getting back together after having not seen each other for years and realizing that they still love one another. It's actually pretty simple. It's just buried under a bunch of like heavy dialogue. I don't. A lot of people are saying the plot's convoluted. I don't really think it's all that convoluted. I think it's the explanations and the dialogue in general are just very arcane, and so that's probably what's giving people this sensation on convolutedness. And there, like I said, there are odd plot beats that emerge from media that like your casual Matrix moviegoer never experienced, never even tried to experience, or wasn't aware that it was an option for them to experience. So, um, but like, is it the worst Matrix movie? Yeah, I would probably still say the third one is probably still the worst one. It's the one. It's the only one that I didn't want to go see in a theater. That was in large part because there's such a short gap in the release schedule between Matrix 2 and Matrix 3 that I didn't. I was still a product of that older movie going culture before we had binge and watching stuff and stuff. Where like, you're used to waiting 2 or 3 years in between getting your special treat of your movie franchise, let alone only waiting 6 months. It's why I didn't bother going out to see Solo. The Last Jedi had just come out. As I've said, like I didn't hate The Last Jedi. I mean, it's not a raucous, super fun, adventurous movie for kids, but as just a statement and framing device to make people realize what crap this was. I really think that subconsciously that's what people hated about The Last Jedi. It wasn't that the movie was bad, is that the movie made them realize what idiots they were for having liked The Force Awakens or thinking that J.J. Abrams had made a good movie, or that Star Wars was actually going to be being run by people who had any kind of vision or plot or desire, or even genuine desire to make these things. I mean, Lucasfilms was a vanity company that was basically just a bunch of people employed to hang around and do side projects for George. And when you pull George Lucas out of Lucasfilm, it's kind of like a directionless company. If we can't tell, now that we've had several years to observe side by side, Marvel versus Star Wars, for instance. I mean, like just looking on Disney Plus, Disney Plus started off with The Mandalorian, yeah, and then there's been like barely anything. There's, especially for live action Star Wars, we've gotten a couple of cartoons. But Marvel's, like, we did have to wait a while to get our first Marvel series, but since it came out, it's just been a steady fucking stream of Marvel stuff. And there's no reason why Lucasfilm couldn't be doing that, beyond the fact that they're directionless and don't really know what to do. They've never had any sort of creative authority or ability to assert their creativity as employees of George Lucas. They're purely there to serve his needs. You can draw designs for starships all day. They're all so much trash unless George just happens to point to one of them when he's looking on his big wall board of variant design, for various ships and technology in his next movie. The best idea they've had arguably was Rogue One, which is just like a prequel to the first Star Wars movie, which really probably should have been like that. That would have been really good as a video game setup. You get to play the Rebel team that takes out the Death Star plans and gets them into the Rebel hands. Like, that could have been a cool video game. I'm just not sure how well that really was as a concept as a movie, especially since it's being made by Disney. So you're never going to get quite the bloody nightmare Saving Private Ryan of Star Wars that you could say that movie maybe wanted to be or deserved to be. But La Matrice Resurrection. Other things that I've thought about it is like while watching it, I was like, wow, this is what Star Trek Discovery wishes it could be. This is what Star Trek Discovery is trying to be. This is what Star Trek Discovery has in its head when it's setting out to film itself and then edit itself and do some post-production. Except this movie actually does it well. I don't know, like there's wokeisms in it, but I don't really know if you would call this a woke movie or a message movie in that way. Part of it could just be a subtle thing that is as much as the people who use the red pill meme in a way that she doesn't approve of might annoy her. Lana Wachowski might be smart enough to also know that like the fact that the red pill meme has been a thing is part of what's kept her franchise and brand alive and of public interest. So and I mean, they've made other movies and stuff, but none of them have taken off. None of them like have really like lodged into the public conscious the way The Matrix did. So if you want Hollywood to keep giving you the free reign to make shit like Cloud Atlas and Jupiter Ascending, and then occasionally you maybe need to go back and dip into the one quantitative guaranteed successful cash cow that you have in your portfolio, just to like keep the studio on your good side. Like I said, it bears rewatching, which is bad movies. Like honestly, bad movies, you don't want to rewatch it to try to figure it out more. There's lots to unpack in this. The messaging is all over the place. In some ways, like I said at the very beginning, it tells you that this movie is being made for cynical reasons, just because the company wants it made, and it's going to be made come hell or high water. And so it's not like there was an inspired thesis that Lana Wachowski had that she wanted to express in this. And so in many ways, a lot of it's kind of filler. In terms of the jargon, that's why I want to watch it again with subtitles, so I can actually kind of unpack, some of the stuff that was being said. I find it interesting, like a lot of like the most woke-ish psychological stuff that was said in the film, it all came out of the mouth of Neil Patrick Harris's character. So that's a thing that kind of like The Last Jedi, I guess, in that. Like, if this is supposed to be pro that agenda, then how come the bad guy is the one who's saying these things? Just like with The Last Jedi. If this is supposed to be such a pro-feminist film, then how come Captain Holdo comes across as such an antagonistic bitch? Like, that's not how you sell people on your message. You sell them by having characters that they like promote this message. The stuff at the end about, like, Trinity being able to fly... they didn't like spell out anything like, she's the one too, and it wasn't something where like Neo isn't the one. It was Trinity the whole time. It was not doing any of that kind of stuff. And in many ways, like Trinity was like the Saruman of this movie, wherein like, her presence in the film is larger than her actual number of appearances. And in some ways, the accusations I hear that it was little fast forward her transition from just being, just someone duped into the Matrix to being, I remember everything. Fuck it, we're gonna fight the man. That was kind of like on a dime, but more justifiable than say like Anakin turning to the dark side, like over the course of like 3 seconds. Because at least that underneath the brainwashing and gaslighting that she's been living under, like she still is her. And so, like the idea that there would be a moment of clarity where she realizes this is wrong and comes back to herself, that's not entirely, out of the realm of feasibility or plausibility. It certainly wasn't anything that, like, throws me out of the reality of the movie's narrative. It's like, I really don't want to say it was a bad movie. It's not the worst Matrix movie. It's going to take more time to absorb it. The complaints about it relying too much on nostalgia, I would take maybe a bit more earnestly from the people saying that if it weren't for the fact that a lot of these channels, especially channels like Geeks and Gamers and Nerdrotic and all them, like they have like literally just this week been slobbing on Spider-Man's knob, so hard over the presence of Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield and Willem Dafoe being in the new Spider-Man movie. And also after like the way they're like, oh my god, Ghostbusters Afterlife, it's the best Ghostbusters sequel ever, it's so great, it does everything we wanted it to do, aside from totally having the Force Awakens final plot chapter. But it just seems to be just the trend. I would say The Matrix Resurrections is better than Ghostbusters Afterlife, and insofar as being an example of its brand. Like I said, if you were to like just list out like just a blind generic list of things that should be in a Matrix movie, it covers most of it. Ghostbusters Afterlife was like an interesting, twist and a way to bring back Ghostbusters as a latter day property, but was it really that much of a Ghostbusters movie, though? Like, I feel there's maybe some wiggle room there, depending on exactly what you mean by what you expect out of a Ghostbusters movie based on what the template, the first original movie had set down. And the fact that this movie's kind of pointless is like I said, it's a feature of it. It's not a bug. They tell you right from the get-go that there's really no reason for any of this. It's just an excuse to reset the status quo so they can then make more movies. And if there's anything we have to benefit from seeing more Matrix movies, is we might at least get that feeling of having had the middle chapter adventures that was absent from the original Matrix saga. Whether or not we actually really need that as a people is, debatable. We don't need any of these things. I will say that, like me and my wife got home and spent pretty much most of the rest of the evening well up past midnight still talking about the movie. So, genuinely bad movies, you don't talk about them very long, aside maybe make a few jokes. You certainly have no desire to want to rewatch it within the next few days. You're not at all curious about, the ideas in it and trying to, like that. That's not the sign of a bad movie. It's never going to be as good as the original Matrix, and by default, because Lily Wachowski is not in the mix of the direction and writing, there is going to be differences. And now, because we've had a standalone Lana Wachowski movie, we can more clearly see what it is that each of the Wachowskis is bringing to the mix when they come together to make a movie. It definitely Lily appears to be the one that was giving you the big artsy, slow-paced, classic kung fu stuff. Which, like that around the time the Matrix movies came out, they're Crouching Tiger, wire fighting kind of kung fu movies. Like there was buzz around that. They were kind of popular at the time. Less so much right now. We're all into like quick cut, gritty, spy thriller kind of action. I don't know. I'm not really sure if like that the action being lackluster in this movie is the worst thing about it, because since all the action is inside the Matrix, it's all imaginary anyway. So, I admired that shaved head Neo and shaved head Carrie Ann Moss were actually allowed to like look as old as they did, and they didn't do anything to try to like soften them and de-age them Tom Cruise style. It was almost shocking because we're like so used to them always like softening these actors' looks that wow, Keanu Reeves is starting to get up there a little bit, huh? And starting to maybe get an idea of what he's going to look like as an old man. John Wick 4, I guess, will be fun. Anyway, I don't know how much more I have to say. Do I recommend the movie? Yeah, if you're an established Matrix fan. If this is your first Matrix movie, no, watch the other Matrixes first. This would be a really weird place to try to jump in at for newcomer. I noticed at the theater, like a couple of people had brought their kids. I don't necessarily think like this is like really a good starter movie for children. But at the same time, there's nothing like so overtly violent or sexual about it that, it's going to like burn their little minds. I don't know. I feel if this movie just had it has any fault is that there's no inspiration for it to be there, but it kind of tells you that from the get-go. It still at least tries to give you some sort of philosophical meat to chew on. Most of it's still just, your typical, is free will real? Are we actually conscious? Plato's cave kind of shit, which we already had in the earlier movies. But, it's like I said, it inspires conversation, which, like, to me is a good sign. I think there's things in it that are memeable, especially with the way blue pills had more of a chance to be portrayed in this movie. And like I said, like any idea that this is somehow going to undermine how people have been using the red pill, blue pill thing, none whatsoever. I dare say this movie is an indication that was Lana Wachowski, for various reasons, is obviously firmly on the side of like the LGBT movement. She might not be as like hardcore woke as people might assume of her. I mean, not knowing her personally, like I can't say one way or the other, but this certainly was not Ghostbusters 2016 by any stretch. So, and just be ready to cut and run at the very end when you see Neo and Trinity flying off into the sky, into the sunset. Just go ahead and start getting up and get out now. The less you have to expose yourself to that fucking terrible Rage Against the Machine cover. I mean, just like some bands, like like some like girl on an acoustic guitar singing an old Nirvana song can be a little off-putting, but at least it sounds all right. Rage Against the Machine probably shouldn't be covered, period, but especially not by a young lady trying to all rap and sound tough. Oh, you people come up. Oh, no, 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 no. Did come home though and watch the after credit scene on the HBO Max, which I feel is, if you want to see the after credit scene, jump out of there so you don't have to listen to those credits. Come home and then just fast forward to the end of the credits on HBO Max, so you can see the after credit scene. It's kind of silly, but like I said, like there's a cynical, bitter tone to this whole thing where, like, to some degree, it doesn't actually take itself seriously, and yet though it's still trying to be a good Matrix movie, if that makes sense. Even though it's acknowledging the fact that there's really no reason for it to even exist. And so, like I said, the only real point to this movie is to just try to shove certain elements of the setup back so that you have some semblance of an ongoing status quo for further Matrix movies. Maybe the thing that would be interesting is like have the next one only be directed by Lily Wachowski, and so we can kind of see the contrast of what a Matrix that is only made by one versus a Matrix that's only made by another, how those things compare to each other, and then how they compare to the Matrix movies that were made by both together. That could be interesting, maybe. I mean, like, if you're kind of just being forced at gunpoint to make more movies on your intellectual property that you felt like you finished, so you don't have a terrible amount of inspiration, you might as well just be experimental with it, or something. I don't know. It's the internet. It's the modern days. Like, people are kind of like pre-programmed to automatically like or hate something just based on what kind of posturing it's been doing on social media and what the premise is and who the people involved in it are. But like I said, like the out of the theater reviews from some people like, John Campia or Chris Stuckman or Jeremy Johns, like they're all like pretty overall kind of like negative to varying degrees. Jeremy Johns seems to be like the most forgiving. Chris Stuckman seems confused. John Campia is just like, this is a bad movie, which is okay because John Campia is just a bad person who is arguably one of the most people responsible for the ruination of film criticism online by having been the one supposedly responsible for starting this trend of framing film and television entertainment speculation shows along the same format as an ESPN talk show, like where you're worrying about the numbers and the actors and who's participating and the stats a lot, just like people who like fret over football and baseball statistics when trying to predict how the fact that he calls like, it's game night for Hawkeye, come to, like all that shit. Fuck John Campia. Because there's like so much shit that's happened downwind of him in terms of entertainment that splashes into the role-playing games section of our little community too, because role-playing games are a form of entertainment. Of just how much as that has leaned into the team sports kind of shit going on in terms of the fan base, where like People are just kind of automatically set up. Like, were we ever going to live in a world where Jeremy at Geeks and Gamers was going to like and approve of a Matrix movie? No, that was never going to happen. The fact that he comes out and he's like, this is just a bad movie. There's not enough kung fu in it. Like, okay, dude, you're a fucking moron. It's fucking shameful that him and other channels like him have made a fucking living and fame and fortune off of complaining about The Last Jedi every day for 4 years now. And because, like, they're dumb. It's probably a sign that their audiences are dumb. A lot of people are dumb. Like I said, like, the popular shit, culturally, like, something being popular is a sign that it's stupid. Because the majority of people are below average intelligence. The thing about average intelligence is that that's a statistical average. It's not saying that the average person is of average intelligence. The average person, the majority of people out there, are slightly below average intelligence. And the reason that the average intelligence is set where it is those small minority of intelligence people dragging the statistic up. But the majority of the people out there are dumb and like dumb things. And it's possible that you might be one of them. And hey, though, I could be one of them too. You never know. The thing about knowledge is that it's actually kind of like a blind spot to be able to comprehend the things that you're not aware of, because you're not aware of them. Anyway, leave comments below. Hit like and subscribe. Tell me, I'm like maybe some sort of like secret WB Lana Wachowski fanboy shill, maybe? I don't know. Yeah. Happy Kwanzaa. Stay waspinated. Get the fuck out of here.